Yeah, I thought I would talk a little bit, and then I'd like to open it up to people's questions and answer as many as I can, and see if we can have any dialogue as well. Um, okay. I I've spoken about gray divorce before, and I've actually done some research in preparation for today. And what do we mean by gray divorce? I mean, it's pretty clear what we mean by it is people with gray hair, obviously. The first reference we could find to gray divorce that was printed was a New York Times article printed on August 8th, 2004. August 8th happens to be my birthday, but nevertheless, this was the first printed article, and the article title was "The 37-Year Itch." It's worth reading, but it's kind of cute, and you can get it easily. New York Times archives, "The 37-Year Itch," and they use the term "gray divorce," and appropriately they talk about a couple on New Year's Eve having a toast, and the wife toasts the husband and says, "Darling, Happy New Year. I want a divorce." I mean, that's how the article starts. Um, in any event, then recall my first gray divorce case, and this morning I found their file, and coincidentally enough, this couple was also married for 37 years. So maybe there is something to the notion of a 37-year itch. But I then looked further into the case. I actually saw this couple, however, in 1990, and they were about 60 years old. They had been married for 37 years. They had grown children. And I'll refer later to some particular aspect about this case, because often the gray divorce case has interesting differences than our regular divorces, and I'm gonna be highlighting those today and talk about it. Um, it got me to think that our our divorce mediation couples, and divorcing couples in general fall into various categories, and we can limit it. I've decided to limit it to four categories, um, and we set a different tone, a different style, and there are different issues with each of these four categories. The first category is the young couples case with no children who've been living together, never really combined their money. They act as if they had a prenuptial, and those mediations are really 1 or 2 session mediations and typically go quite smoothly. So we'll call those the young couple divorce. Then with no children. Then there's the couples in their 30s and 40s with younger children. I think this remains, for me in my practice, a major part of it. When we see couples in their 30s and 40s, they have younger children. There's the questions about overnights. There's the questions about child support. There's the questions about vacations. I think we develop a real expertise after a while in dealing with these couples. And they have really been, I think, for many people, for many mediators throughout the country, the main couples we work with, because couples with children particularly find mediation to be an attractive way to do things, because they really want to, they hear it's better for children. The next category is a category of the somewhat older couple with children in their last years of high school or college. Here, there's no parenting custody issues. Child support is of a different nature, and we know what's happening. And there are those couples as well. But now I think we have a fourth category of divorce, which is the older couple in their late 50s, early 60s, even in their 70s. Recently saw a couple, both of whom were 70. And they actually said something. They said, they said, we can get divorced now. Both of our sons just got divorced. So that was an interesting thing. And it reminds one of the story of the couple who was married for 75 years. And they're in court. The judge says, yeah, you're married 75 years. You're in your mid-90s. Why are you getting divorced now? And they look up to the judge and they say, well, judge, we were waiting for the children to die. So we have those couples. And the question is, why do we see this growing number of gray divorces now? There's census data. we're going to get a lot more data when the 2020 census comes in. The last year that we have really good data is from the 2010 census, where they track such things. And we know that the divorce rate in people over 55 jumped dramatically from 2000 to 2010. But let's see what happens with the 2020 census. I think that understanding why more divorces now is important. One, there are more people now. Baby boomers came of age recently, of age in a number of ways, and these are the people who are getting divorced now. Of course, divorce is much less of a stigma now than it was when any of us were growing up. I often ask this question: does anyone remember any of their grandparents' friends getting divorced? And the answer is, for me, no, and anyone else, no. My parents' friends got divorced, started getting divorced when they were in without children, and if they had children, very few of them got divorced. This is back in the 1950s. In their 30s, early 40s, some people started getting divorced then, but no one later than that. And even in my parents' generation, I don't recall anyone getting divorced in their 60s or even late 50s. So we see that one of the reasons attributed to it, and I did some reading on this, is certainly everyone agrees that it's the greater life expectancy. It's the greater life expectancy that allows people to do this. I've often felt that when a life expectancy was 32, 35, there was very little divorce. And so a 65-year-old person says, gee, I got another perhaps 25 good years ahead of me. Do I really want to live with this person for another 25 years? And the answer is no. Something that's some of the therapists researching this or talking about this in the literature talk about the fact that men have what they see as another chance to have a more active romantic sexual life, and that this motivates them to look for a divorce after age 65 or 70 even. However, most of the divorces in this age group are in fact initiated by women. And most divorces today, of course, are initiated by women, a significant change going back over the last 40 years, for sure. But the real reason that I've come up with for this tremendous incidence of divorce is a whole other category of people who are over age 55. It's the second marriage divorce. It's people get married, they have a young marriage, they get divorced young, they marry someone else, they may or may not have children with the second person. But the divorce rate, and this is a figure that I found in a couple of places, the divorce rate in second marriages for people over age 55 is between 70 and 75%. So if you know someone over age, no. So in fact, that very high divorce rate in people over age 55 in second marriages contributes to this. We know that when they quote the divorce rate as being 50%, it's misleading, because the divorce rate in first marriages is much lower than the divorce rate in second marriages and third marriages and subsequent marriages. They have not a lot of data on fourth marriages, but certainly in second marriages and third marriages, there's a much higher divorce rate. So we're going to see this population increasingly. And so the questions come up is, what are some of the special issues that we really need to focus on and be aware of when working with the older couple? We'll call them the older couple. So I guess the first thing that occurs to me is, as mediators, what are our own personal reactions to seeing such a situation? Well, a couple of things come to mind. One, if you're 55 years old, have you just gone through, or are you contemplating a great divorce yourself? And if so, will that affect your work with this couple? I'll let you answer that and decide how to proceed with that. The other situation is if you yourself, when younger, and depending how old you are now, experienced your parents' gray divorce, I think you need to be aware how that might influence you. Uh, I must say that, the question of do people come to mediation and what percentage wind up deciding not to get divorced? Perhaps we can have another webinar on that topic and on marital mediation, which I would look forward to doing. But assuming that that's not the case, that the parties seeing you for divorce mediation are in fact going to get divorced, what are the things we need to be aware of? Well, as I just said, first of all, we need to be aware of our own reactions and feelings when we see a couple going through a great divorce. And then the question is, what are some of the special issues that we need to be aware of for people going through a great divorce? What's different about a great divorce? And there are a lot of things that are different, and they strike you right away, depending on the age of the people and whether they're working or not. So some of these things, and I can send notes out. If we have people's emails call, I'm going to be transcribing, this talk. Actually, Max will be, and I have my notes, and I'll be glad to send them out to people. I have them in separate places, but I will certainly do that. So one of the issues, well, the first thing that occurs to people when they're getting through a great divorce is have they been doing retirement planning? And often I've seen people, they bought a house somewhere that they're planning, that they go to sometimes in the winter for long weekends or even on vacations. And now they're not going to be going to that house together. And so we see situations where people really are not going to be having their retirement plans together. And so we have to be aware of that, for starters, that most people in their 60s have made plans to retire. And now they're not going to be able to do that in the same way, certainly. And that becomes a real problem. Of course, there are issues. I'm going to really be focusing more on the financial issues today, but there are issues like, how do you tell your children, kind of thing. How do you deal with your grandchildren? There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff on that, on working. How do you plan your daughter's wedding? And I've had many situations where we have to do that. But today I'm going to start off. I'll answer questions about that. But today I'm going to focus more on the financial issues. When we have the older couple, the finances are different, even if there's no pre-retirement issues at this moment. One, we look at their assets, and their assets are most often more complex. People in their 60s have more complex assets than people in their 30s generally. There are more assets. Some are more valuable. For example, people have had a chance to acquire wealth. Very often, people have a vacation home. In fact, the case that I spoke about earlier, the case of the couple, my first great divorce in 1990, it goes back a long time. And I didn't have any for quite a while after that. They stood out, and I remember their last name, and I pulled the file this morning. For them, the major issue was their retirement house in Vermont. They valued it. Their children grew up there. Their grandchildren came there with them. It's the family house, and they were going to have trouble sharing it. We spent a lot of time talking about how they would deal with the house for a number of reasons, including that one of them was involved in another relationship, that one of them did not feel comfortable sharing the house with the other person. They wouldn't be there on the same weekend or the same week if the other person was going to bring someone else there. But we looked at this. This was very painful. It was the most painful part of the mediation. They had enough funds to divide up and live comfortably, and the house itself had very little value as houses go. So there is going to be the issue sometimes of a second home that people have a very strong attachment to, and the financial way. How do you deal with sharing a house with someone? Do you share all the bills? Do you pay for the electricity depending on how many days you're there? I mean, there are all of those financial complications, but there are more assets. There are often more valuable assets. There may be collectibles. There may be paintings that people have, artwork, rugs that people have accumulated in a 40-year marriage, in a 37-year marriage, I should say. So the assets are more complex. They also include, if one of the parties has been working in a privately owned business, do we value the business? What is it worth now? Did they bring in a junior partner? You see that happening a lot. If one of them worked in a large organization, do we have deferred comp? Do we have restricted stock? There are any number of other things that have to be valued. And when people are in their 30s, you don't really have this problem typically. And I think so there's more problems with valuations. There's more problems with second homes. There's more complexity to the gray divorce finances, without a question. And then you get to the very complex issue of alimony. And were people planning to retire and stopping to work when they were a certain age? Will that person be allowed to, will the payor person be allowed to stop working now when they otherwise would have? And had they gotten divorced a year later, they wouldn't have been working. Do people have to go back to work? Now, I'm not familiar with the case law on this in New Jersey, and I didn't bother to check what the case law is on this. And I have to imagine that it's very complex and all over the place. And depending on how much wealth is being distributed, and are people able to live comfortably or almost as well as they did before on the interest dividend income from their wealth, but most often people can't. And so we have these very special problems that come up, particularly now with the gray divorce. So the alimony issue will be, I think, a substantial issue in many, if not all of these cases, in a sense. There's another issue, which is one I hadn't originally thought of, but came across it. It's the emancipated child issue. It's the support of an emancipated child. And I think everyone probably knows what I mean. While there's nothing in an agreement that says that people have to support their children until they're 35 years old, notwithstanding that health insurance up till now requires employers to cover dependent children till 26, many parents, and this is not a secret, many parents are supporting their children past the age of 21, past the age of 25, I think that's fairly common. And when people get divorced, this issue, they were supporting them together. Kids go back to school, kids do any number of issues. They're not kids, of course, they're young adults, or they're not even such young adults. I think that the gray divorce precipitates out this financial issue, and I think it's something to include in an agreement. The fact that people are still supporting their children, will they continue to support them, or one of the parents say, well, if you want to support them, if you want to support him, her, then feel free to. I don't want to really do that. I was never in favor of it anyway. And so there's the question of, do you include something like that actually in the divorce agreement? And my answer would be yes. You're not obligated to support your children past a certain age, but it needs to be dealt with. And so emancipated children represents a problem. More complex problems have to do with trusts that were set up during the marriage. Now, we're not going to have time to go over the specifics on trusts, and one needs to get someone who's very expert in that to come in and look at the trusts. When people set up the trusts during the marriage, they did not contemplate divorce. Their house might be in the trust. There's a life insurance in the trust. So there's a lot of complexities, again, that you're not going to have with couples in their 30s or even in their early 40s most often, that you'll much more likely have in couples in their 60s. And so the whole issue related to trusts is getting the whole issue of estate planning, that people have estate planning, which now is going to change. Are they going to be, you know, what have they done in estate planning has to be changed now as they divide their assets. And a particular piece, and it came up yesterday, Friday, in a case where the couple's getting divorced and one of them is likely to remarry. And the question came up, do you have in the gray divorce clauses, and are they enforceable? I assume one can make most anything enforceable unless it's against public policy. Can you say that people will, if they remarry, that people will enter into a prenuptial agreement and leave 60% of their estate to their children or some such thing? We're typically not worried about people in the gray divorce having more children, but they are going to have another family in a sense when they marry someone. And so that particular issue of estate planning strategies changes. And I think we should probably, someone should really give an advanced training on this and on this whole topic related to the gray divorce. We've done it, but not to such a great extent. And this is something to consider, certainly. So you're going to have a lot of changes in trust and estate planning that have to be dealt with. Another big financial issue, which affects everyone during divorce, but particularly affects certain people between the ages of 60 and 62, is health insurance coverage. As we all know, Medicare coverage is available at age 65 for people. And I've had many situations where people in their early 60s, one of them is working and covering the other person on a really good health insurance plan, and they're planning to work till they're 65. Let's say they're both 60 years old. They're planning, and one of them has really good coverage and covers the other person. And health insurance is very expensive now. And so what do you have here? I've had situations where people are going to wait until they're 62 to get divorced. Then the person, if they get divorced, can at least get the COBRA coverage for 36 months, bringing them to age 65, at which point they may get to Medicare, they would be eligible for Medicare coverage. So this is a consideration that you have all the time in divorce, health insurance coverage, but I think you have it in a really particular way, and we look to see how old people are. And while COBRA coverage may not be inexpensive, it may be important. That person may be using certain providers and they don't want to get any other kind of insurance. So we have to look at health insurance in general as a variable, as a financial variable in the gray divorce. I'm going to take questions in a few minutes, but in summary, I think we need to be very sensitive to the issues around gray divorce and be respectful of where people are in their life with this. And also, one of them may feel that they want a divorce and one of them doesn't, as often is the case in divorce. And so the question is, what do we do related to that? I mean, this isn't going to be a counseling session, but we may really feel the need to refer people as well, not only to individual therapists, but to divorce support groups for older people. There are such groups in certain places, and one might want to start one even, if nothing else. And so there are very special needs, and there are people who have a lot of difficulty with their own gray divorce, and unless both people are really, you know, of the same mind, which is most often not the case, though sometimes it is, we need to be aware of that and make referrals as needed. So those are some of the issues related to the gray divorce. And I think we all can talk about experiences we've had, questions we've had, and we can start a discussion now about that. Hi, Carl.
Hi, Ken. How are you? Okay, excellent. Let me ask you a few questions.
Sure.
First, on the emotional part, you said that most women are the ones who are seeking the divorce at this age, and that's certainly been my experience as well.
Yes, without a question.
What are the husbands like when they come in? Have they bought into this already? Are they passive? Are they angry? Or
well, you know, the person, that's a very good question. I think generally speaking, the initiator, as we now wound up calling the person, though it's really not so simple, feels really good about it. They can't wait, you know, and the other person, depending, doesn't feel too good about it. They have from a mild to a moderate to a severe time in dealing with it. Some people really fall apart. I just flashed on the Woody Allen movie. It's an old one with E.G. Marshall, where he announces at the breakfast table to his wife and kids that he wants a divorce. And his wife runs in the next scene, his wife runs into the ocean, I guess out in East Hampton, and drowns herself. Maybe it was Long Beach Island, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, that's the next scene. You remember that movie, Max? The Woody Allen movie with E.G. Marshall. We'll give people the reference. It's an old Woody Allen movie, and this is a gray divorce that goes really bad, certainly. And I just flashed on it, and we'll give you the title in a minute. Interiors, of course. The movie is Interiors, worth watching perhaps over this next week or so, and see how E.G. Marshall handles it and how it affects all the people at that breakfast table.
So are you seeing a lot of opposition from the husbands who say, no, I want to stay in this marriage?
Well, you know, the answer is yes. I mean, I think people, see, often people have tried counseling before, but when someone buys out of it, when someone buys out, as I call it, of a marriage, very few people can be talked back into it. They bought out of it. I think if people had gone to couples counseling first and then come to mediation, then you have a better situation. But I think you need to give people support. In general, I think, you know, I think it's the answer in general. But I think the people who have more trouble with the gray divorce is the spouse who earns less money, because people, when you look at the AIG ads on TV, all of these ads, it says, will you outlive your money? Now, this is a new concept. The fear, there should be a diagnostic category, the fear of outliving your money. We'll have to come up with a good name for that. But that's being promoted. And people I work with, financial planners I work with, we're now calculating people living to 95. And, you know, 10 years ago, we didn't do it much past 80. And now financial planners are saying, will you have enough money to live a certain way till you're 95? Well, that's a long time if you're 62 years old. And I think the non-moneyed spouse will often panic. You know, I often, you know, yes, I think that is the case. The non-moneyed spouse, most often the woman, and typically, though not always, will panic, particularly if there isn't enough. Well, yeah, I got 10 million, I should be able to make it, kind of thing. I think that's where you see the panic. Now, there's also, it's not like one person says, I want a divorce, this marriage has been dead a long time, and the other one says, what are you talking about? We have a great marriage. You don't get that very often. Very few people have such a different opinion of their marriage. But yeah, I think one person is often very upset, Carl, particularly in the gray divorce.
Right. I found that a lot of the older couples don't have a lot of money. Their biggest problem isn't estate planning. It's more that they have spent a lot of money on their children's education, much more than they could have really afforded. Fancy weddings, and they're now at an age where they barely have enough to retire, maybe even not enough to retire, and there's no time left to accumulate anything.
Well, I think
so they're really in a tough situation.
Yeah, I know the situation you mean, and that makes it, as always, less money makes it much more difficult. I think that it puts a burden back on the children to help them out. If they spend all this money on education, the children should at least have some money for them. I think you're right. I think that parents, this generation, uh, the Gray Divorce generation, previously had another name before they got divorced. It was called the Sandwich generation. And we'll check to see when the first reference is the Sandwich generation. These are the people who are supporting their children and supporting their parents at the same time. So these are people in their late 40s, early 50s, who have elder parents who they're supporting, and they're supporting their children through college, graduate school, postdoctoral education. I mean, and those people now maybe don't have a lot of money. And I think that the planning is very tough. You do see people, and I have a friend who retired on what he thought was a lot of enough money to really not work. He moved from Florida to Arizona, and he realized, and they lived very well, but he realized that he was going to have to go back to work, which he really hadn't planned on. But investments were down, etc. And so people sometimes in this Gray Divorce really find themselves going back to work, or not retiring as soon as they would have otherwise. I think the people you're referring to, Carl, will now not be able to retire, or the spouse who has less of an income or no income, let's say typically the wife, unfortunately, may find herself having to go to work at age 62, where she wasn't planning to, because they thought they'd have enough money for a kind of, not great retirement in 5 years. She may now have to go to work where she hasn't worked for a long time, or she's worked part-time or some such thing. I think that's a real challenge, Carl. I think those cases are out there as well. Yes.
Let me remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Are you finding in these, let's say, divorces in the late 50s, 60s, that there are more equalizing the income that each party receives, or is it still sort of the typical, if you use the rule of thumb in New Jersey, 1/3 of the difference, so that there is still a substantial disparity between?
Actually, 1/3 of the difference, interestingly enough, is part of the formula in the New York State alimony statute as well. There's two formulas, and one of them is 30% of the difference between the incomes. But if someone has a zero income, of course, that raises the number. I think that the notion of equalization is one that many couples feel is appropriate, many mediators feel is appropriate, and the question is, what to do about that. By the way, my colleague Steve Abel wrote an article a number of years ago about Social Security. It's on our website, I believe it's on our website, divorcemediation.com. The title of the article is Social Security, the last injustice or the last big insult. The fact is that when people retire, their Social Security payouts are different. And Social Security is a defined benefit pension in every sense of the word. If we have one non-working spouse, that spouse is entitled to 50% of the working spouse's Social Security. So let's say the wage earner is getting $3,000 a month. Let's say both people are over age 62 or even over age 65. If, let's say it's the man getting $3,000 a month, the wife is getting $1,500 a month. They're now getting divorced. And while we might equalize other defined benefit pensions, the tendency to equalize Social Security benefits is almost non-existent in the various states that I've spoken to mediators from. And do you see anyone in New Jersey doing that? Let's equalize our Social Security benefit.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure there are people who do it and raise it. It's not my experience that comes up.
It doesn't come up because people don't think about it, which then raises it's right, it doesn't come up. It's like the check gets put in your checking account or your savings account. No one thinks about it much. And your Medicare, certain parts are taken out of it. But the truth is that it raises the question, if mediators, and I assume most of us are mediators, if mediators are mediating a gray divorce couple, should the mediator, this is the question, I'd like to see how people vote on this, should the mediator raise the question of, oh, what about your Social Security benefits? I always ask people to bring in their Social Security statement, whether they're collecting or not, to see what their benefit will be. And the question is, do we count Social Security income as income? Do we count it as a defined benefit pension? Or do we not count it at all? The tendency to not count it at all, I believe, is a mistake. And I think we have to decide as mediators, do we want to raise it? Which gets to the more complex issue of what do we raise and what do we not raise as mediators? And when do we raise things, when do we not? Are we benefiting one person and hurting the other one in a zero-sum game? These are very complex questions. My advice is to raise the Social Security issue at the very least. Ask people what their benefits are and say, gee, how do you want to deal with that? If they say, oh no, we'll each keep our own Social Security, it's not my job to then say, what, are you kidding? Let the person's review attorney raise that, if they even raise it. I've seen very few attorneys, very few mediators raise the question about Social Security, but in the gray divorce in particular, I think we need to raise it. Yeah.
Now, how do they treat the situation of a long-term marriage? As a wife hasn't worked most of the time during the marriage. They're now getting divorced, but they're close to retirement age, close to Social Security retirement age. How do they treat that in New York?
How do they treat alimony? Oh, it's part of the factors. I think we use the formula that exists, which includes 30% of the difference in incomes. And that's the first thing. The duration is based on the length of the marriage. The duration is based on the length of the marriage. So in a long-term marriage, one would expect a 50% duration. In a 30-year marriage, let's say a 40-year marriage, you'd expect 20 years. Except the guy's 65. Are we going to have the guy work till he's 85? And what if he can't? I mean, I think that's where it gets complex, because the usual formula of duration is going to take some people well into their 80s to meet that requirement. And do you say, well, too bad? If the question is how do courts handle this, I don't really know the answer. And I'll find out. I don't know how courts handle it in New Jersey. I think all of these cases are in some ways unique. And I would suspect that in most of these cases, the payee does worse than the payor, and most often the woman. And I think that's typical of most cases with divorce. In fact, even with changes, they kind of roll back to another level. But I think the Social Security piece should definitely be raised by any mediator working with a gray divorce couple, and treat it like what it is, a defined benefit pension. You get a certain, with a cost of living increase, which just came through for 2019. So that's how I would see it.
But you would admit that is a certain bias on your part, is it should be included. And if it's never raised, like it's seldom raised, I think in New Jersey, that's sort of a hint that we think it should be included and split.
Well, you can call it a bias if you'd like. And I talk a lot about biases, it doesn't feel like a bias to me. It feels like it's on my checklist when I look at people's assets and income, and I look at Social Security income. Is it a bias? Yes, it's a bias to be fair, but I think it's appropriate. I think there are some biases that if someone doesn't, someone's leaving a meeting. Okay, I think it's appropriate to raise questions about all of the assets, even if the couple doesn't raise it. Well, they might not know about someone's defined benefit pension. I mean, do you raise that? Why would you raise that and not Social Security? The fact that people don't raise it doesn't mean that we should continue not to raise it, as opposed to increase awareness of it. That would be my feeling. Yeah, it's a bias I have, if we want to call it that.
Okay. I have a comment here. It says, need to make sure that there are no offsets against Social Security, for example, for teachers, government employees, etc.
You say offsets. That's a good point. I think so. You see, we can see Social Security either as a defined benefit pension and give it a present day cash value, versus it's a stream of income, and I'm getting another $3,000 a month in income and you're getting another $1,500 a month. I would agree with that. I can't think of any situation that I've been involved in or know of where someone offset Social Security benefits against some other asset, for example. I would agree with that.
Right. And here is, as it says, not a question, but I agree with Ken that Social Security retirement income needs to be raised as it constitutes income to be disclosed in mediation. How the parties deal with it is up to them.
Well, thank you, whoever that is. Thank you.
That's Gary Borger.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Gary. Thank you. Yeah, well, I think it's really important. If nothing else, perhaps this webinar has raised the question of that awareness, and we should do this. We should cover this in our basic training in New Jersey, and I will make sure we cover it in New York as well.
Yeah, and Megan Altman comments, I do budgets to determine if everyone is going to have enough to live on, appropriate to include Social Security in that. Boy, this one's getting a lot of comments. Or, this is Suzanne English, or a police pension that stops once ex-spouse dies. How do you deal with that benefit and no Social Security?
Well, we're talking about people who may have had pensions and weren't included in the Social Security system. I assume that's Suzanne's question. I mean, I think the question is, what do you do when you have, I mean, this has to do with the right of survivorship and what election people made at the time that the pension was entered into. Is the wife, but this is a very complex question, and I think you have to, one, look at people's ages, look at what election they took. Presumably they can't change their election now at this point. When I'm not sure if I understand the question completely, Suzanne. Are you saying when the wife dies, if she predeceases the husband, he's not going to get a larger benefit? Is that what?
No, actually, in police pensions, there is no survivorship in New Jersey.
I see. In New Jersey.
So it's just over.
It's over. Yeah, well, originally when you're doing the original the divorce, and if you have a gray divorce with a police pension, yeah, I think you have to accept what the reality is that you've been dealt by the nature of the pension plan, or the nature of the pension plan, or and account for that in your equitable distribution or support arrangement. You know, in a sense, look, it's a landmark case that, you know, goes back, and I don't know, where alimony, where someone dies, the payer dies who's paying alimony, and the payee went after his estate to get alimony, and then in fact, no, once you're dead, you don't have to pay alimony anymore. What a relief to many people. But in fact, the truth is that when you do the divorce, you know, at the onset, you will take into account what the payouts will be in the incomes of both parties, and yeah, of course, and sometimes people have an, you know, where you have a pension where there is an election, you know, and in fact, then you do it differently. So these things have to be very carefully looked at and calculated. I agree.
Has anyone looked back, this is more from, I guess, a sociology point of view, the people who say, okay, I want to get divorced, it's late in life, it's going to make my life better. Has it worked out for them? Has it actually,
the answer,
are people satisfied?
There is data on that. Yeah, the answer is for the most part it does. And I think, yeah, the data on that is for the most part it does, because in fact, well, the person who wanted it is usually happy about it, and the other person is happy about it. The reason it works out, particularly, I think, is that that marriage has often been dead, my term, for a long time. It's a dead marriage. And notwithstanding the economic insecurity that comes from living two households, I think most people, you know, and Max is saying, yes, there is data on it, that most people report this was a good move. You know, I wish I did it years ago, kind of thing, almost. So I think the data is impressive, but we're not suggesting that all people over age 60 get divorced. You know, that's not the suggestion. We don't have data. It's not like we're going to do a controlled study. We took 50 couples age 60 and told half of them to get divorced.
Right.
We divorced half of them. The other half we told to stay married. And then 10 years later, we check back and see if people were happier. So you can't do a controlled study. Max has some data. Yeah.
That New York Times article followed a big study by the
Yeah.
by AARP.
Yeah, AARP did a study. Yeah, the 2004 article, which people can get, called The 37-Year Itch, from August 8, 2004. They follow an AARP study, a follow-up. It's a little less than a controlled study, but the AARP study suggests that people in the gray divorce are happier, report being happier. That's correct. Not every single one.
Despite there's initial distress, but the satisfaction rate is higher than with younger people.
I think it's interesting. While there's initial distress because there's anxiety, what will I do New Year's Eve? You know, like that kind of thing. I remember back in college or high school, you didn't break up with someone in November because you wanted a date for New Year's Eve. So I think the same thing may be happening now to people. Well, gee, that's why this woman in the 37-year itch, on New Year's Eve, she tells him at midnight that she wants a divorce because she wanted a date for New Year's Eve, which is understandable. We always wanted that, and I guess we still do. But the truth is that older couples, as compared to younger couples, show a greater satisfaction with the fact that they got divorced once they get past their initial anxiety.
Right.
So that's good to know. I mean,
it is good to know.
Good to know. Yeah.
There is hope for those people.
There's
Excellent.
definitely hope for those people. Yeah.
Well, Ken, I want to thank you very much. I really enjoyed this, and have a great day.
Thanks. And if anyone has specific questions, they can reach me by email, for example.
Okay.
Thanks.
Why don't you give your email again?
Oh, it's Ken Neumann, my name, at teammediation.org. Easily available, and our website is divorcemediation.com, and you can reach me directly by clicking on my name on that as well. And also, if we have a list of the people who signed up for this, when we transcribe this talk, my notes, I'll be glad to send it to people as well if we have such a list.
Well, you know, Ken, this is being recorded.
Yes, yes.
And it will go on YouTube, so you're going to be world famous, although you already are. So,
well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Okay, bye. Happy holidays.
All right, bye.
Bye.